So the PSVR2 is finally here, and this past week has been a big one for the channel and for PlayStation gamers in general, and as someone who has never touched VR beyond playing about with the original Samsung Gear a little and my dad's PSVR, I really didn't know what to expect from the experience, whether or not it'd be worth the heavy investment and whether or not I would actually enjoy it. And so in today's video I'm going to be talking about my experiences thus far as someone completely new to VR, and hopefully giving you a bit of an idea of what to expect if you're considering taking the plunge into the world of VR gaming. With that said though, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more PlayStation content, and let's get started. So let's start by talking about the system itself, and like I said, the only thing that I can compare it to is the Samsung Gear, which had you clipping in your mobile phone and playing for what the most part were a bunch of low budget indie titles, and the original PSVR with its massively cumbersome umbilical cord and somewhat finicky light based motion tracking, which used the PlayStation camera and Move controllers for many of its games. The PSVR2 on the other hand has a tiny cable which you can toss over your shoulder and is barely noticeable. It uses inside out tracking with the camera set into the headset itself and sense controllers to detect your hand movements. And I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of how all this works as I don't really understand it myself, but functionally, while I did experience a couple of minor tracking issues, usually after my hands went out of sight of the cameras, overall it's pretty accurate and does a good job of tracking even faster hand movements. When it comes to the comfort levels though, the headset feels super light, and unlike other systems which were very front heavy, once wearing it the presence of the PSVR2 was much easier to ignore. It can be a little fiddly to start with to prise it apart and slip it on, but the foam-like headband sits comfortably against your forehead, and even after playing for about 3 or 4 hours solid, unlike previous experiences, I wasn't just relieved to be free of it, and my face felt a lot less compressed. A lot of this I feel is down to the rubbery accordion style light guard, which fits softly against your face, blocking out 90% of the light, whilst also providing plenty of room for people who wear glasses, as Alex can attest to. And there's a button on the front of the visor which allows you to slide it in and out to give the area around your eyes a bit of a breather without actually releasing the headset entirely. Just don't make the mistake of pushing it too close to your face, as it can feel a little uncomfortable around the nose area and also disrupt the image quality. Now when it comes to eye comfort, with the older VR tech, eye strain was a real issue for me due to the low refresh rate and the low resolutions, meaning that I noticed every little pixel, as though I had my face an inch away from an old TV, which is apparently known as the screen door effect because it looks like you're viewing the world through a mesh. But thankfully with the PSVR2 there's none of this. Image quality is sharp and vibrant overall, and you can no longer see the individual pixels, though due to you viewing the world through lenses, there is a little colour bleed and blurriness to objects and text if you're just moving your eyes to look at them and not turning your head to face them directly. And the sweet spot, or the point at which the visuals were at the sharpest, is pretty tight with this headset. But with a few up and down adjustments it was easy enough to hit and then lock in by cranking the dial on the back of the headset to vice grip it to my cranium and prevent movement. Finally, whilst some people have complained about the limited field of view, I'd say that all VR headsets kind of feel like you're looking out through some ballistic goggles which limit your peripheral vision, and it's just something you're going to have to get used to. But rather ironically, I actually thought that it added a little extra immersion to some of the first person shooters. Overall though, a really comfortable headset to wear. Now when it comes to the sense controllers, prior to using the system I heard many people mention that they were a right nightmare to pick up due to the shape, and let me tell you now, they're not wrong. It's almost impossible to work out which hole to slip your hands through whilst handling them blindly, but the headset has a pass-through button instantly enabling you to see through its cameras, which feels a little bit weird but is a literal godsend when trying to pick up those suckers and get a grip on them. Like the headset though, the controllers themselves feel light to handle and don't put too much strain on your arms when you're swinging them about, and while the hand grips are pretty smooth and could do with a little more grip to them, even with sweaty palms I had no issues holding on to them. The overall build quality though is pretty good, and they don't feel like they're shattering to a million pieces if you accidentally hit them against a wall. Though on a couple of negative notes, I felt like the thumbsticks were a little small and were placed a little too close to the face buttons, and in some games if your hands disappear out of view of the headset's cameras, the visuals suddenly tilt to a weird angle, which can be quite jaunting and disorienting, particularly I'd imagined for those sensitive to motion sickness. Overall though, the way in which your hand movements are translated into in-game motions is pretty awesome, especially how pressing and releasing the grip button or trigger or loosening your hand a little moves your fingers in the games, and the adaptive triggers feel great when firing weapons, as do the vibrations of the haptic feedback, especially in the headset where you can literally feel things like branches brushing up against your head in games like Kayak VR. Now, there are plenty of other things to say about the tech, but like I said, I'm not getting into the finer details, but overall I was really impressed by both its functionality and comfort. And I'll end this segment with a note on the in-ear headphones which come with the system, because initially I was a little bit skeptical as to the quality of them, but after using them I can safely say that they're actually pretty good, and for the majority of players I'd say that slipping on an additional set of headphones would be entirely unnecessary. Though if you do look at using your own, just be aware that due to the headset, certain headphone shapes will be a much better fit than others. So now we come on to talking about the gameplay experience, and if you've never used VR, prepare to have your mind blown, and it's hard to put into words how much the whole experience not only messes with your senses, but also your perception of reality. And I'll start by saying that even after you take the headset off, you're likely to have some really weird sensations, like a feeling of being detached from reality, kind of like being in a dream, and it can really feel a little bit uncomfortable to start with, but this feeling definitely fades as your brain gets used to distinguishing between the virtual world and reality, so that's just something to be aware of and something that I don't think many people mention. Now, different VR games have different play styles. Some can be played seated whilst others require you to be standing or to move about the place, and this is something that's important to bear in mind, as depending on the size of your play area, you'll technically be limited to which type of games you can play. Setting up your play area is extremely simple, with the PSVR2 pretty much doing all of the work for you, and you can cheat the system by drawing in some additional play area to play full room games, but just be aware that the boundary warnings which are displayed in game to stop you bashing into stuff won't really work, so you'll just need to be really careful and avoid walking into walls. Though despite these, it's still pretty easy to get turned around and lose your sense of direction, or occasionally bash your hands into stuff, especially if you're playing in a box room like I am. Now when it comes to in-game controls, depending on the game, these are generally pretty intuitive, as you're essentially mimicking actions that you perform in real life, albeit with a button press or two to grab or interact with things. But I found that most VR games were very easy to just pick up and play without any lengthy tutorials, though like standard games this often comes down to the complexity of the gameplay mechanics. From what I've experienced though, you shouldn't have too much issue with getting to grips with them, and the most trouble I had was probably with reloading my weapon in Pavlov VR, but many games try to keep things simple and require a minimal amount of hand gestures. Now on the topic of comfort, seated games are definitely the easiest to handle, both in terms of physical exertion, because believe it or not, VR feels a bit like a workout after playing it for several hours, and also comfort levels when it comes to motion sickness, which is undoubtedly the biggest hurdle to overcome for most new VR players. And if you're particularly susceptible to motion sickness, this is really going to limit your enjoyment with certain types of games. And it's a bit of a sliding scale with motion sickness, but they generally fall into three main brackets. On the low end of the spectrum, you have completely static games which feature 2D or 3D gameplay from a VR perspective, such as Tetris Effect, or ones with fixed cameras requiring very little movement from the player, such as What the Bat. Taking a step up, you have the low motion games where the camera moves but usually does so slowly. You can often remain seated throughout these experiences, and they include things like Kayak VR's Exploration Mode or the puzzle game Fantavision, or alternatively you have games such as Cosmonius High, which uses a teleportation mechanic for moving around. Finally, you have the real stomach churners, which generally involve lots of fast camera movements and have the player moving about manually using the thumbsticks, and these can really mess with your sense of balance, especially when falling or moving up and down slopes. But these include games such as Pavlov VR, After the Fall, and even Minecraft. And even as someone who isn't really affected that much by motion sickness, I often came away from a 2-hour play session of these kind of games feeling a little bit queasy and disorientated. It's worth noting though that many of these games attempt to alleviate the motion sickness with certain accessibility settings, such as the aforementioned teleporting mechanics, camera snapping which rotates your perspective in increments, and visual vignettes which limit your vision but can sometimes help. And most of the games that I played featured at least a couple of these settings which you could then just toggle on or off. Depending on how much motion sickness you experience though, there's an awesome selection of games to choose from with the PSVR, and so far some particular highlights for me have been the awesomely chill Kayak VR, Pistol Whip, which is essentially a rhythm based shooter with a phenomenal soundtrack, and also Pavlov VR, which plays like a VR version of Counter-Strike. And I've had some hilarious interactions with people in that one, especially thanks to the game's proximity chat. If you're thinking about picking up the PSVR2 as a family system though, I'd say that VR is definitely designed for solo experiences or for online use with other players, and I haven't found any local multiplayer games so far with PSVR2, though there were a few on the first PSVR such as Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes, which had one person using the headset while spectators used the on-screen footage and gave them directions. And you do of course have the option of playing locally by passing the system between players, but things like the IPD settings, which adjust the lenses for different eye widths, and the fitting of the actual headset itself need calibrating each time you do this, so this option can be a little bit of a pain. So after a week or so of extended use, I have to say I've come away feeling thoroughly impressed by the quality of the PSVR2 and the lineup of games on offer, and so far I've played about 10 of them, all of which I've thoroughly enjoyed my time with. Though, like I said, the simple act of playing VR is a lot more strenuous than just sitting there with a standard controller, and I've got knackered knees which didn't fare too well with prolonged periods of standing. For most people though, you can expect a few aching muscles the day after a heavy session, and don't be surprised if your eyes feel a little strained or if your senses in general feel a little bit weird, especially just after coming out of a play session. It definitely takes a bit of getting used to, but the more you play it, the less these things are supposed to affect you, and I definitely recommend drinking plenty of water whilst playing and taking regular breaks, as these should help reduce any discomfort or motion sickness and generally just ease you into the experience a little more gently. Overall though, VR will no doubt prove to be unlike anything that you've ever experienced. It envelops the senses and enhances the gaming experience in ways that you can't even imagine, and it's just something you have to actually try out yourself to fully appreciate. In my opinion, it's unlikely to ever replace standard controller gaming, mainly down to the negative side effects like motion sickness. But all in all, the PSVR2 is an awesome bit of tech, and I feel like its first iteration was well before its time and came a little too soon, but we've had a huge leap in quality since then, and with an awesome lineup of games ahead of us, 2023 may just end up being the year of VR gaming. With that said though, hopefully this has given you a bit of an idea of what to expect from the PSVR2 and VR gaming in general, but please share your own experiences down below, as well as any tips, guidance or game recommendations that you have for new VR players. If you're looking for more VR content though, be sure to check out our live streams and reviews for more info on the games themselves, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more PlayStation 5 content, as well as regular deals videos. But for now, thanks once again for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Thanks everyone. Take care.